Hey guys, it's Dominique. I hope that you're doing well. In case you don't know, I am full-time faculty in the MPH program where I teach 504, the theory class, as well as Capstone 1 and Capstone 2, 508, 509. And I am also the Capstone 2 course director, which means that not only do I help troubleshoot problems for students and assist faculty when different issues come up, also trying to maintain some level of consistency across our sections, I am also responsible for organizing the presentations. And so you will hear from me closer to presentation time where I will touch base with you about everything that you need to know for logistics. And in the meantime, schedules will get going as soon as I have titles and abstracts. So a lot's going to come together for you guys in the next few weeks as you start preparing for your presentation. And one of the things that I also do as Capstone 2 Director is make sure that as you're preparing for your presentations, you're really thinking about doing a little skill building with regards to your public speaking. Now, one of the reasons why I love to do this, and I actually do this lecture for all of the Capstone classes, this is my first time recording it online because we have so many sections. I usually come and do it in person. But I taught public speaking for a number of years when I was teaching at Temple University, and I've done a lot of public speaking coaching with not just students, but also with executives. I really love helping people to feel more comfortable in a public speaking space. And as future public health practitioners, you should expect that you are going to end up doing potentially a great amount of public speaking throughout your career. So what I did was, after teaching a few semesters of Capstone, I noticed that there were some pretty consistent issues that were coming up for my students in Capstone 2 that were getting in the way of them being as successful as they think they could be with public speaking. So I put together this talk. I started giving it to my class, and pretty soon my class started blowing everybody out of the water. I'm going to pat myself on the back with that, with their presentations on Capstone Presentation Day. And so I was asked to start giving this to all the classes, and I'm happy to see that students have reported to me every semester that it's exceptionally helpful for them. So there are really two main issues that I want to address today, and that is this very important issue of managing apprehension and nervousness with regards to public speaking, which I think gets in the way for a lot of people. And the second is that there are definitely ways to strengthen your speeches that many of our students don't have familiarity with until I introduce them. So I want to discuss with you briefly today how to strengthen your speeches by using organization to your fullest capacity, as well as what you should be including in your introduction and your conclusions. And I also want to introduce you to the idea of having a clear CI, or a clear central idea in a speech. Now, this is something that you might not have heard of before, but I guarantee you, once you learn about a CI in the speech, what you will find is that when you listen to speeches that have a clear central idea, like when you're sitting in the audience, you will automatically be more tuned into that speaker. You will be more engaging with your nonverbals to that speaker. You will follow along better. And these speeches always come along as stronger. When it's missing, you're going to notice. And so I want very much for each of you to have expressed your central idea in your speech by no more than about 3 minutes into the speech. Why? Because in a 10-minute speech, if you wait longer than that, you're missing an opportunity to engage your audience for your entire speech. So today I'll introduce you to what a CI actually is and how you can create one for yourself. Let's first talk about managing apprehension and nervousness. I'm sure if you're watching this, at some point you've probably had some level of public speaking apprehension, some more than others. But the important thing to remember is that if you do, it's totally normal because everyone gets nervous. And even though I am exceptionally experienced in public speaking and I'm pretty comfortable speaking in front of a group of even thousands, that doesn't mean that I don't have a little bit of anxiety going into it. The trick is learning what to do with that anxiety and nervousness and understanding where it comes from, which is actually a really positive place. You know, first is this desire to do well. Obviously, you want to do a good job. That can make you nervous. And the other is really just an issue of self-esteem and pride. And what I mean by that is not in a vain way, more that you should have a lot of pride in the work that you've put into whatever you're presenting, particularly with your capstone work, but as well as the other work that you'll be presenting in your professional lives. And what you want to make sure is when you go in front of a room, that you are demonstrating that same level of confidence, professionalism, and competence that you brought to the work and the project itself. So you don't want to come across as somebody who isn't really experienced in this work or who didn't really pour him or herself into working on this experience. Of course, you want to be able to Demonstrate that. So that issue of self-esteem is really natural and is very healthy. So the next time you feel yourself starting to get nervous with regards to public speaking, try to remind yourself, look, I'm nervous because I want to do a good job. That's normal, and that is a rational thing. I find that sometimes people will say to themselves, oh, there's nothing to be nervous about. There's nothing to be nervous about. And when you kind of objectify it that way and you already tell yourself that your feelings are wrong, you can make yourself more nervous. So instead say, hey, it's completely normal to be nervous. I really want to do well. But let's talk about some of the things that might happen to you as a result of your nervousness. Now, physiological effects are really normal. Some really common ones that I see include things like sweaty palms or even really sweaty armpits. Maybe you just become sweaty when you speak. Getting really shaky with your legs or your hands. Maybe feeling some tummy ache, butterfly sort of things going on in your stomach. Or maybe even feeling faint. There are so many other physiological effects that I'm sure you can think of that you've seen in yourself or in others. Some people tend to get really quiet when they get in front of a room. Others have trouble controlling the volume of their voice and it gets really, really loud. Some people might be naturally dynamic in real life, but when they get up in front of the room, they become very monotone like this, and it's kind of robotic and it's boring to listen to. And like if you had a professor like this, especially in undergrad, and they were very monotone, it puts an audience to sleep. It's exhausting. Some people struggle because they have skin reactions. So when they start speaking, if they're a little bit nervous, they might start with a little bit of redness, splotches that might come up across their chest and up their face. And by the time they finish, their entire face is red, their ears are on fire. It's a real struggle for them. But what I want you to understand is that physiological effects are normal and they do get better over time. And what's really cool is I have tips and tricks for dealing with almost all of them. I'll give you even just a few of them in a few minutes. But if you have any sort of apprehension with regards to getting up on your capstone presentation day, and I haven't addressed that in this talk because this talk is something that I'm recording sort of generally for everybody, please email me and seek me out so that I can help give you some tips to help you, because my students have told me that my tips are a real game changer, so I really want to assist you. I think one of the most important things to remember is that most of the time, the audience can't see your nervousness. I can't tell you how many times a student has come up to me after an important presentation and I say, oh my gosh, you killed it. You were so great. I'm so proud of you. And they're like, oh my gosh, I was so nervous. I don't even remember what I said. And I'm like, really? I didn't even know. And when you remember that the audience can't see your nervousness, that alone can help sometimes bring down your levels of anxiety. So what are some things you can help do to control your nervousness? That's really what we want to get at. Well, there are some things you can do even before your speech. And one of those things is to know your audience. When I say know your audience, I don't mean that you have to know them intimately. It's great when you're in school and you do often know your classmates or your professors or other friends that you might be speaking in front of. But most of the time, honestly, in your professional career, you might not personally know your audience. When I say know your audience, what I mean by that is think about who you're speaking to. You would not give this speech the same way to a group of medical physicians that you would to a group of public health folks. This is really important for those of you to consider who do have a clinical background and might be used to giving clinical presentations. You also wouldn't give the same presentation on the same topic the same way to different professionals that you might be speaking with. Or imagine that I was talking about the importance of sexual education programs. I would give that speech very differently to a group of maybe some school principals versus a group of sixth graders versus a group of college students versus a group of policymakers, right? So if you know your audience and you design your speech for the audience, you're less likely to be nervous because what you will see is that your audience will automatically engage you in more nonverbal feedback, positive nonverbal feedback that will help take down your anxiety as you're speaking because you'll see their smiles and you'll see their head nods and you'll know that they're following along with you. They are less likely to give you that positive feedback if maybe your presentation is really kind of going over their head or it's out of left field. Or say you're talking to a really conservative group and you choose the wrong topic. I mean, selecting an appropriate topic is important, both for you and your audience. I wouldn't speak to a really conservative group about certain topics. I would think about whether this topic was most appropriate for them so that I can make sure they're more likely to be tuned into my speech, and that's going to make me less nervous. Think about how you can prepare and organize your content in advance. And you want to do that by obviously researching what you're going to discuss. So you never want to just kind of wing it in front of a room if you can help it. At the very least, you want to have an outline of where you're going. That will help to control your nervousness. Of course, nothing helps control anxiety about public speaking better than practicing. Practice, practice, practice. But there's sort of a threshold for this. If you've practiced so much that you generally have an idea of where you're going next in your speech, and you can use your slides as cues to help you do that, but then all of a sudden you start second guessing everything on your slides, and you start thinking, oh, this sounds really stupid, or this speech isn't even worth it. You've probably over practiced. So I always suggest to my students, practice maybe once or twice a day before presentation day, but that's it. Don't be practicing all night long. Don't be practicing all morning long. Practice until you feel like you know where you're going when you have your visual cues. And your slides are your visual cues. You should never, and I do mean never if possible, walk up to the front of any room to give a presentation with notes in your hand. That is a big no-no. And there are a few reasons for this. Number one, if you are nervous and you have notes in your hands, then everyone's going to know you're nervous because all of a sudden they're going to see your paper shaking and it becomes quite apparent. So right then and there, that's going to backfire on you. But number two, you don't want to have notes in your hands because chances are you don't need them anyway, and they will become a crutch for you, and you will break your engagement with your audience because you'll break your eye contact. It's really important that when you design your slides for your talk, you design them in a way that those are your speaker cues. So all you have to do is look up quickly at your slide and use that as your cue for what to say and then move on. Those are your notes. Don't take notes up with you. Now, what's the caveat and the exception to this? The caveat and the exception is if you need to have some sort of a paper or a note card up there with you because maybe you want to have a stat that's just right, that's not on your slide, but maybe you're thinking about the Q&A afterwards. And what if somebody asks you a question about this and you don't want to say the wrong thing? Or maybe there's a particular quote or something you want to be able to reference later. Then the appropriate way to handle that is to bring your notes up with you, leave them at the podium, which is not where you're going to stand. I'll talk with you about that in a minute, but leave them at the podium. And if you have to refer to those notes, just slowly walk over to the podium in a very casual way while you're talking, pick that paper up, read that note that you have to yourself, put it back down and keep going, right? Or if somebody asks you a question and you say, oh, I was hoping somebody was going to ask me about this. I actually wrote a note to myself. And you pick that up and you read it and you put it back down. But you really don't want to be holding your notes. And so if you find that as you're doing your practice, you're continuing to read notes, you might then go into another mistake, which is that you start memorizing your speech. And the only thing worse than carrying notes up with you is having a memorized speech. Because a memorized speech comes off as being so disingenuous to your audience. I mean, really, an audience doesn't want to see somebody who's not being genuine. If you've ever sat in an audience with somebody who had a memorized speech, it's like they're talking at you, not like they're talking with you. So you never want to memorize your speech. Instead, you want to follow what's called an extemporaneous speaking style. An extemporaneous speaking style means you've practiced this, you have your outline, you have your notes on your slide, you know where you're going, but each time it's a little bit different. It's more fluid. Like this talk, for example. I've given this talk, if I had to guess, at least 1,000 times, and I'm like not exaggerating. I'm not being hyperbolic with that estimate of the number of times I've given this talk in different capacities. It's different every time. My notes are exactly the same. My slides have not changed, but what I say is unique each time. Be familiar with your intros and your conclusions. Now, this is the only place, guys, that I suggest, okay, if you have to memorize a little, do it here. And here's why. A lot of times people find that they're super nervous in the beginning. Maybe you know that when you are starting to give a speech, you tend to speak a little rapidly to the point where people can't understand you, and then you kind of get over that hump and then you're okay and you're normal again. You can get into the good stuff faster and get over your anxiety more quickly if you really know your introduction. It's something that you don't have to think about. So I strongly suggest that you are really familiar with where you're going in your introduction. And with regards to your conclusion, remember that when people are listening to a speech, what they remember about a speech is how it ended, believe it or not. It's the last thing they heard. If you gave a great speech and then all of a sudden you see that you're running out of time and you just cut it short and you're like, oh, okay, in the interest of time, that's it. You're going to get this weird, like like this funny slow clap where people are like, okay, is she done? Okay, yeah, okay, yeah. And then it speeds up. It's so awkward and it's a real letdown. So know where you're going in your conclusion so that even if you do start running short of time, you know how to quickly transition yourself there and tie everything in a nice bow. It's important before you do a speech that you visualize yourself being calm, walking to the front of the room, giving your speech with a smile, doing it the exact way that you want to do it, killing it in the Q&A afterwards. Visualization is so important. It's why professional athletes visualize their matches, visualize their games, visualize their scoring, their goals before they go up, because they've been trained to do this by psychologists, because we know visualization works. So those are things you can do before your speech, but that doesn't mean you're not going to still get nervous on the day of your speech. So what are some ideas of things you can do on the day of the speech? Well, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to focus on your message and not the fear that you might be feeling. So how can you do this? Well, when you're sitting there waiting to go, maybe you're coming up on deck, there's one or two speakers ahead of you. I want you to take out your handouts. Now, you will see when I email you with the logistics for Capstone Presentation Day, all of you will be required to bring 3 copies of handouts of your slides so that each panelist can have a copy to follow along. So you'll have them with you. And even if I've collected them in advance, I want you to have a copy for yourself. And instead of focusing on how you're feeling, I want you to look down and I want you to just start going through your slides over and over. What are you going to say? How are you going to say it? Focus on your message. Don't focus on your feeling. And your brain, believe it or not, only has the capacity to focus on one thing really well at a time. So if you're putting all your energy into focusing on your message, that's less energy that your brain can focus on with regards to how you're feeling. Similarly, you need to think calm in order to act calm. So if you're sitting in your chair thinking, oh my gosh, I'm so nervous, I'm never going to get through this, everybody's going to know that I'm so nervous, my mouth is so dry, blah, 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 and it's like things start falling apart, you're going to have a really hard time acting calm and thinking clearly in front of the room. So sit back in your chair, sit leisurely, comfortably back in your chair. Don't sit with your back so straight that it looks like you're trying to have a board in your back. Sit in a relaxed way and think like, okay, I'm going to do a great job. I got this. I'm totally calmed down right now because I know I can be successful. I've practiced this. I've done a dry run of this. I know this information better than anyone, and that will help your body to respond in kind. If you go blank because you're nervous, if you lose your place, do me a favor, just move on. Don't make it worse by trying to figure it out in the moment and go back over it in your head. First of all, most people in the room, in fact, probably everybody but you, is not going to know you lost your place. Maybe if you were dry running this for one of your classmates a few times, they might know, like, oh, she was supposed to say this here, he was supposed to say that there. But, I mean, come on, nobody's a mind reader, and they're not going to say anything. So if you go blank, if you lose your place, move on. Now, there's a rule to how to do this when you come up with the idea later, right? I mean, have you ever been in the middle of talking and you lose your place and you're like, oh, I don't know what I was going to say, whatever. So you move on and then you think of it inevitably 30 seconds later, 3 minutes later, or maybe 30 minutes later. So the rule of thumb is if you're in a speech and you lose your place and you move on, which is what I want you to do, if you're still in that section of the speech, meaning like maybe it was something in your background section and you're still talking about background stuff, or maybe it was an element of your methods that you forgot to mention, but you're still talking about methods, it's totally okay for you to say, oh, and I would like to also add that, or to then just go ahead and say it. But say it was something from your methods section, and now you're like all the way through, you're into presenting your results, and now you remember that you forgot to say that in your methods section. Don't mention it. Just let it go. And chances are you will likely have an opportunity to address this in your Q&A. You might even get a question about it and you can say, oh, thank you so much for asking me about that. I actually meant to mention that earlier and I forgot to do so, right? If you go blank and you lose your place and it's not mid-sentence, you can even move on without saying anything. But what do you do if you're like mid-sentence and all of a sudden, did you catch me? I just lost my place, right? It's really obvious because I said all of a sudden and then nothing. So it's completely appropriate for you to just be like, I lost my thought. I'm just going to keep on going, because that makes you a human being. You might get a little chuckle from the audience. We've all been there. I already told you don't hold up notes, especially if your hands are shaking. I also don't want you to move too much if your knees are weak. Now, here is the one area where a podium can be helpful. So, by and large, my number one rule for public speaking in professional settings is dun, 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 not just don't memorize your speech, but don't stand behind a podium. There are so many important reasons for this. Number one, most important reason, it breaks your engagement with your audience. There is nothing more important than that. If you have an engaged audience, you will have a killer speech. Regardless of how many problems come across in your speech, you forgot something, you meant to say something a different way, you fumble over your words, doesn't matter. If your audience is engaged, your speech is going to rock, okay? If you break audience engagement by standing behind a podium and you lose that connection, you can't recover from that. And you know that because you've experienced that in an audience. It feels different when someone is standing behind a podium, doesn't it? And it feels more like they're speaking at you instead of they're having a conversation with you. So I always recommend, especially on Capstone presentation day, that you stand on the other side of that projector slide of the big screen in front, away from the podium, because you'll find that students who do that end up coming across like they're stronger speakers and they're more engaged with their audience, right? So number one is it breaks your engagement. Number two, okay, maybe you're lucky and you're like Robbie Schnall and you're like 1,000 feet tall and it doesn't really make a difference in terms of your height. But for most of us, especially me who's only 5 feet tall, it can visually interfere and it looks like there's sort of like a bopping head across the front of the room, which is never so fun. Another reason why I strongly encourage you to not use a podium is because when you use a podium, there is a tendency for you to do things out of nervousness that you don't realize you're doing. You might start clutching the podium in front of you, grabbing onto it. I've even seen people clutch the podium and while they're talking, involuntarily start doing push-ups on the podium. Didn't even realize they're doing it. On any professional podium, there's typically a computer monitor. And there's a natural tendency when you have a monitor in front of you to look at it. But what you should be looking at is what your audience is looking at. So you should be looking at the projector in the front of the room and your audience. That's it. You shouldn't be looking at a computer monitor on a podium. It will really interfere with your ability to come across with a strong speech. And last, and perhaps the most important reason, I guess tied with my number one of don't break your engagement, is that for 99% of your professional lives, you are not going to have a podium. You're going to be giving a speech in front of a conference table, in front of a room of people, maybe out at your friend's wedding, whatever it is, and there's not going to be a podium. So you have to practice and become comfortable with what it is to just stand in front of a room and just be there by yourself, you know? You have to do that. That being said, if you're feeling weak or if you're feeling faint, you can use a podium by walking over to it and casually leaning your hip and your leg against it on the side while you continue to talk. Nobody will know that you're nervous. It'll look super cash, super cool, but it'll provide you that kind of extra assurance that you need. If you don't have a podium nearby and you're feeling weak or you're feeling faint, you can do the same thing with a chair. So I always like to make sure if there's not a podium around, there's at least a chair in the corner, you know? Or you can walk up to the table where people are sitting and kind of just like prop yourself against it. Think about how you can channel your nervous energy. So it's important to breathe. Breathe. Sometimes people forget to breathe when they're speaking. And before you go up to give your speech, you can absolutely work on deep breathing. If you have stomach issues, like maybe you tend to feel really sick in your stomach, nauseous, or get some butterflies or whatever, actually, one of the reasons why that happens to us physiologically is because we're not getting enough oxygen in our system. And when you start doing some deep breathing, just subtle deep breathing, what it does is it relaxes those butterflies. It relaxes some of that nausea. So sit in your chair leisurely and just sort of breathe slowly. When you walk up to the front of the room, don't start, when you know that it's your time, don't start like doing this like fast speed walk to the front of the room. Walk leisurely. When you're sitting, like I said, don't sit like you got a board in your back. Sit in a relaxed way. Wiggle your toes. Now this might sound really silly, but honestly, people tell me over and over again, oh my gosh, I can't believe that works. When you're standing in front of a room, if you feel yourself starting to feel faint, or if you've ever had this feeling, you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes you'll be giving a speech in front of a room and you almost feel like you're having an out-of-body experience. like you're there and you know there are words coming out of your mouth, but you almost don't even know what you're saying, like you're not in your body. Do you know what I mean? If that starts to happen with you, I want you to start wiggling your toes in your shoes. Sounds kind of cray, I know, but it works. They think because what it does is it kind of brings your awareness back into your body and it centers you in the floor. It's the same technique that we use when we're coming out of meditation, or if you do yoga and you come out of shavasana at the end. They'll tell you to wiggle your fingers and toes, right? And that's because that's how you can create your awareness back to your present space. Another thing that works really well for helping to control nervousness is to squeeze the edges of your seat or the desk in front of you really, really tightly with your hands and then release slowly. I know, again, this probably sounds silly, but it is super helpful for getting rid of anxious energy in your body. It's very similar to like a muscle progression relaxation technique where you squeeze your muscles really tight and then you let them go. The same thing works really well when you squeeze the edges of your seat. So hopefully you got some ideas in that first segment about how to manage apprehension and nervousness. But if there's something that you struggle with and you're like, oh, she didn't talk about this, reach out to me. Oh, one thing I didn't mention that might be helpful. If you are the type of person that you have skin reactions and you get really red and it starts to like work up your chest and into your face, I strongly recommend that you wear a high collared shirt, because that will help to hide it from your audience, and knowing that your audience can't see it makes you a lot less nervous. And be thoughtful, everyone, too, about the colors that you wear. For example, some color shirts show sweat more than others. So if you tend to sweat, try to wear something that's darker in color, because if you're wearing something that's like light blue or white or gray, that's really going to show up and that's going to make you feel more self-conscious. All right, let's talk about the second thing, which I think is important for our Capstone students, which are thinking about growing skills to make your speeches stronger. And one of the ways that you can do that is with a really killer introduction. Let me tell you what an introduction is not. Number one mistake I see in Capstone students. They get up in front of the room and they say, hi, I'm Dominique and I'm here today to talk about, and they turn and they read the title of their slide. Don't ever read the title of your project, okay? Everybody in the audience can read that title, okay? You don't need to do that. Instead, you should just be telling them what you're talking with them about and connecting with them, because reading a title is not the same thing as introducing a speech. An introduction should serve 5 functions. It should gain your audience's attention. It should introduce them to your topic and your central idea, which again, we'll talk about a CI in a minute. You've got to give them a reason to listen. Listen, you might think that your audience has a reason to listen because they're in the room with you. Absolutely not. I mean, how many times have you been in a room, maybe even right now, you're listening to me talk and you're like, I don't know, I'm just not into this, or I'm thinking about my grocery shopping or whatever. In fact, the reason why you need to design your slides as speaker cues and have enough notes on there that they can tie you back in is also because in any given speech, your audience is going to tune in and out maybe about 20 times. They're thinking about their own lives too. So you need to give them a reason to listen to you at the beginning. You need to establish your credibility. Now, one thing that will be nice for you is that once you have this graduate degree, by nature, just having your name up there with some credentials after it often gives people a reason to want to listen to you and an established level of credibility. But you need to establish your credibility with regards to this particular topic. And then ultimately, as you're introducing what you're going to be talking about, you're serving really a transition into the body of your speech. Now, without even thinking about this, I can give you an example of how I kind of did this at the beginning of this talk, right? So I told you we were going to be talking about, and I said to you that one of the things that we noticed is once I started doing this talk, my students became such better speakers that I was asked by our program director to start giving this talk to all of our Capstone students. And ever since our Cap 2 students started to get this talk, their presentations are like way better. Well, hopefully that gave you a reason to listen. I also told you that I have a background in teaching and coaching public speaking, and that's because I have a few degrees in communications. I have a health communications background, so hopefully that helped to establish a little credibility with this issue as well. And I told you what the 2 issues were that we were going to talk about today, right? So I said we were going to talk about managing apprehension and nervousness, and we were going to talk about how to make your speeches stronger. So that's sort of my transition to the body. Now let's talk about a central idea and what it is. Again, if you remember like nothing else from this talk, here's what I want you to remember. A central idea is really important. It makes for a much stronger speech, and I want you to try to make one. When you are in the middle of dry running with your classmates, I want you to listen for their central idea. If they don't have a clear central idea, I want you to help them find it. What is it? A central idea is one sentence you say that sums up the whole main idea of your speech. When you were in high school and you were learning how to write papers, remember that they would tell you that in your background section of the paper, you had to have one sentence that sums up the whole paper? Or they'd say to you, like, tell me what you're going to say, then say it, then tell me what you just said, right? You know what I'm talking about. That thesis statement, that's your central idea. And it stems from your specific purpose. For example, a central idea might be something like, with proper treatment, those who are diagnosed with HIV are able to live productive, healthy lives for much longer than many people realize. If I say that within the beginning few minutes of my speech, you know exactly where I'm going with my speech. Exactly. And because you know what's to come as an audience member, you will be much more likely to stay in tune with me. It stems from the purpose of your speech, and let's talk about that for a second. So every speech has some sort of a general purpose. Either you're looking to inform people about something, you're looking to entertain them in some way, or you're typically looking to persuade them. But then each speech also has what's called a specific purpose, which is the goal for your speech. Like at the end of my speech, my audience is going to understand the various treatment options for those who live with HIV. And depending on your purpose, your central idea will change. Let me give you an example of how a central idea might be different even with the same topic, okay? Because each speech has its own central idea. So let's say my research topic is, what can the government do to reduce the amount of junk food that is consumed in elementary and secondary schools? All right, that's what I've been focusing on. If I were to give a speech whose purpose is simply to inform, so an informative central idea, then my central idea might be something like, pouring contracts are a common arrangement between soda vendors and school districts. So you know what I'm about to do is explain to you what pouring contracts are and what they do. If I was looking to propose something to you, and I might do a proposition, CI, so something like, pouring contracts do not provide an overall benefit to students and educators of schools. So if I say this at the beginning of my speech, you know, in this speech I'm taking a clear side here, and I'm going to start arguing for this side. Maybe I'm doing a policy speech, so I say something like, federal and local government should regulate the type and amount of pouring contracts that are allowed within school districts. So now you know that's what I'm going to talk about. So you can see that within this same research topic, 3 very different central ideas, and they let you know where I'm going in my speech. I want you to try to create this for yourself. Some things that can work really well for a successful introduction, if you have a story, maybe this can be a story that you make up. Maybe it's a story related to a participant that was in your thing. Maybe it's something that was recently in the news. If it's some sort of an example that you can tie in, something to take your topic and basically put a human face on it so that people will connect with it. One example of when this worked really well, a few years ago, I had a Capstone student, and she was a pharmacist. And her capstone project was focused on the use of polypharmacy, meaning multiple prescriptions, by senior citizens, and how this was growing so much, and what we could do as public health professionals to help improve communication across specialists so that, you know, somebody's maybe rheumatoid arthritis specialist is in connection with their general practitioner, whatever. And she thought, this is not a topic that a lot of people are really going to be into. This is not something that they're really going to have a lot of familiarity with. So she started out her speech with a picture of an older woman. And it looked like any older woman that you might know. Maybe it's your grandmother, maybe it's your neighbor, and she called her Dolores. And she told us about Dolores. She said, I want to introduce you to Dolores. Dolores is 86 years old. She lives in, she gave us the area where she lives. These are her health issues. These are the prescriptions she takes for them. And these are the specialists she sees. And instantly, you could see that across the audience, everybody was picturing their Dolores in their head. Like they were imagining their grandmother, they were imagining their great aunt, their neighbor, whatever. It really connected with people. So you should think about if there is some sort of an example or a human story that you can use. Now, sometimes people like to use a startling fact or a startling statistic. Here is very important takeaway for that, guys. This only works well if it's actually startling. You got to remember that. So, for example, you don't want to start out with something like, as many as 1 in 8 women in the U.S. will be diagnosed with breast cancer in her lifetime as your statistic that you're trying to wrap people in with, because This is something we've all heard. Like, unless we're living under a rock, if we've ever watched television, in October Breast Cancer Awareness Month, we've seen it on every commercial. And we're public health people. This is not that startling. How do you know if something's actually startling? Typically, it's because when you've been dry running or you've been working on your deliverable drafts, you have said something, and in your presentation, maybe it was in your capstone update presentation, and you kind of saw your classmates be like, wow, or somebody said to you after, wow, I really didn't know that. Something like that can make for a great pull-in for an introduction. A quote can also work really well, but again, not if it's a quote that's tired that everyone's heard of. So you don't want to start out with something like, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with just one step. And today I want to talk to you about the first step that we're taking with this pilot program on blah, blah, blah. Like it's totally going to backfire. So maybe it's a cool quote from a participant in your program. Maybe it's a cool quote from Gandhi. I don't know. But it shouldn't be something that everyone has heard a gazillion times over. Now, humor can work great for pulling people in. Just make sure it's appropriate, back to the earlier part of this presentation, for your audience and for the topic. And again, if you ask a question, which can also be a great way to help pull in an audience in the beginning, you got to make sure it's really thought-provoking. And you have to tell your audience how to respond. Because it's super awkward if you throw a question out to your audience and they don't know if they're supposed to respond out loud or not. Say you didn't want them to respond out loud, right? So as you've been practicing and dry running, you've been asking it more because you just want them to have it in their head. It's like a rhetorical question, but you know that if you have them thinking about it, it'll influence the way they listen to your speech. So that's cool. But if you have practiced it that way, and all of a sudden on your presentation day, you ask this question and people start raising their hands or shouting out answers, it's totally going to throw you off, right? On the other hand, say you want people to shout out answers or raise their hands and give you feedback. And you ask the question and it's like crickets. No one says anything because they don't know they're supposed to do that. That backfires too. So what you have to do is whenever you ask a question in a presentation, you prime your audience. So you'll say something like, all right, I'm going to ask you a question, not something that I need you to share out loud, but something that I want you to be thinking about in your head as we're talking today. When was the last time that you blah, 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 right? Okay. Or alternatively, all right, I'm going to ask a question and I love to just hear the first thing that comes to your mind. I'll take the first few answers. What do you think about when you hear blah, blah, blah? So you prime your audience so that they know. Sometimes a great way to introduce is to just refer to other speeches to show kind of the connection. I was presenting one time at APHA, and so I was part of a panel. If you go to a conference, you'll often be presenting something with people who are doing somewhat similar work, right? And the first person talked about obesity in high school students, and the second person talked about obesity in preschool age children. And I was talking about something related to obesity in middle schoolers. So this wasn't how I practiced or anything, but I got up in front and when I started, I said, I think it's really cool that We've just had the opportunity to hear about some of the complications of overweight and obesity that are really well established by the time our students get to high school. But we've also talked about how some of the precursors to this can happen as young as preschool age, and yet at that age, so many of our children don't have the wherewithal to be able to share what they're experiencing or to start making their own decisions. So I feel really lucky that I have the opportunity to talk with you about what happens in the middle when our students are, between the ages of 11 and 14, and they're starting to experience these changes, and at the same time, they're starting to develop some autonomy over their eating behaviors and the exercise, and what are some of the implications of that? And then I went on and I started my speech. So it pulled people in. Sometimes, if you have nothing else to do, you can always just refer to the occasion, thank you so much, I'm so glad we're all together to celebrate such and such getting married today, maybe you're a best man and you're giving a speech that way. But once you're into the speech, another thing I want you to think about is how you can use different organizational plans to help improve the way that your audience follows you and engages with you. It's pretty natural to think about a chronological order. That's what most people do, and that can work really well for topics that have a time-based order. So first we did this, and then we did that. If you are part of a parent project, Or maybe you did a secondary analysis. Or maybe there's a really huge project of which you're just taking one small piece in the middle. Then you want to set that up maybe on a visual, on a slide, chronologically. Maybe you'll have like phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And you'll go through that and you'll say, for the purposes of today's presentation, I just want to focus in on phase 3. And then you kind of walk us through that. And that could work very well. But sometimes it also works very well to use a topical organizational plan, where you have some sort of a thematic division. So first I want to share with you what we found when we looked at gender differences. Then I want to share with you we found what we looked at racial and ethnic differences. This can work really well if you've got a topic that's complex or if you've got a lot of moving parts that you're going to be presenting. So you can present them one topic at a time. Spatial presentations also work really well. This might not be something that you thought of, but say you've been working on a project where you compare different environments. Maybe you're talking about comparisons between rural environments versus urban or suburban environments, West Coast versus East Coast, things like that. And think about spatially as well, how you're going to organize your slides. So in the English language, we read from left to right and top to bottom. And we think about geographic locations in terms of like coastlines and stuff like that. So you want to make sure that as you're animating your slides and developing your slides, your audience is looking at your slide from left to right and top to bottom. It's awkward when something comes up on the right side of a slide first and then the left side. We feel like there's something missing. So think about how you can organize your material better. And then as you're going through it, use your transitions, verbally and non-verbally, to help your audience understand in your organization where you've been and where you're going. And the reason why we do this is because we need to help our audience summarize, think about where we've been, know where we're going, and sometimes we might even have keywords that we want to emphasize. And again, this is important because in any speech, your audience is constantly tuning out, tuning in, tuning out, tuning in, and you need to be able to keep them with you, catch them up to speed. So one way that you can do this is to repeat a keyword or a synonym. I told you that extemporaneous speaking is about when you are using, you've practiced, you've got an outline, you know where you're going, right? You've got cues. I've got notes here on my screen, but I've not memorized my speech. So let's say I've got 3 major parts of my speech. One that I'm going to talk about extemporaneous speaking style for, what it does for a speaker, what it does for an audience, how you can organize, blah, blah, blah. So I could transition by saying the same word over and over. So I could say something like, extemporaneous speaking style is really valuable for speakers because it allows them the flexibility to blah, blah, blah. Extemporaneous speaking styles, also super important for audience members because it allows them to blah, blah, blah. Extemporaneous speaking styles make life so much easier, and I can go on from there. So you can repeat if there's like a particular key word to help kind of section out your speech. Enumerating. So first we found this. Second, there's been an increase in. So the relationship of your findings. So in addition to these findings, we also, so you can think about like how you go from one idea to the next. Maybe you're coming out of your background section where you've just established your gaps and your aims, and now you want to talk about your methods. So you can say, so how did we address those aims? Boom, and you're kind of showing the relationship of the previous idea to the next, and you go into your methods section. Or you're finishing up your methods section and you say something like, so now that we've done this, what did we find? And that lets me know that you're transitioning to your results section. Previewing and summarizing can be helpful. Now that we've discussed the problems caused by declining rates of literacy, let's look at some possible solutions. All right, let's talk about nonverbal transitions. You don't always have to transition verbally. Sometimes just changing your facial expression will do. I mean, if you've ever watched the news on television, you know that they have a very different facial expression when they're talking about the Philly Fanatic being there for somebody's 100th birthday and a tragic fire that happened in Kensington. So you can use facial expressions to let me know I'm going to a new area of my speech. You can use movement. In other words, you can start your speech on one side of the the projector in the front of the room, and you slowly and casually move to the other side for this next part of your speech. Or maybe you move in a few steps towards your audience to emphasize something that's coming next. Pausing. Now, a pause can be very helpful. Remember that your audience is always 1 to 2 seconds behind you, so a pause can help them catch up. A pause can also emphasize something. But when you do pause, you really don't want to pause longer than the pauses that I just made. So I just made like 5 or 6 pauses in there to demonstrate how to pause. But here's how a lot of people pause when I tell them you speak too fast and you need to practice pausing between your slides. This is what I get. And then they talk again, right? That's way too long of a pause. If you're naturally a rapid speaker, I want you to practice pausing at the end of each slide for about this amount of time. That's it, okay? That's enough for your audience to catch up to speed. Vocalics refers to changing your voice. Maybe you're, get a little bit quieter, you get a little bit louder, you get a little bit more animated, you get a little bit more excited. You want to make sure that you've got enough up and down happening. And again, this is very similar to, changing your facial expressions. So we speak very differently when we're talking about the Philly Fanatic coming to your 100th birthday party than we do when we talk about the Kensington Fire. So think about how you can use vocalics to transition your speech. When you get to the end of your speech, you need to have a conclusion, okay? And a conclusion has certain functions, just like an introduction. It summarizes your points. It kind of lets people know, okay, we're bringing this down home. It sometimes will re-emphasize your central idea in a memorable way. It might be appropriate that it motivates the audience to respond or to act in some way, whether it's with questions, whether it's with something you want them to do. Most importantly, if it does nothing else, it provides closure, and your audience needs you to give them closure at the end of a speech. So how can you do this well? Well, you can refer back to your introduction, especially if you had a story, like I gave you the example of my student using that story about Dolores. If you have a story that worked really well, you had an example, you might want to refer back to that. You might have a certain clincher. So maybe you didn't have this at the beginning, and maybe there's a quote that pulls it all together. Maybe there's a question that you want people to consider further, or you have some sort of a final story. If it's appropriate, provide a call to action. I'd love for you guys to think about this the next time that you're engaging with a patient who struggles with this disorder. I'd love for you to keep this in mind, especially if you're a parent who's dealing with a child who's blah-de-blah. I'd love for us to be more thoughtful about this as we're approaching issues of social justice. I'd love for you to think about who you can contact about this, or just thank you so much for listening. I'd love to take your questions. So if a call to action is appropriate, give it. It's really a nice thing to say thank you. That's sort of a good measure for closure, to thank an audience for giving you their attention. Whatever you do, there are 2 things I don't want you to ever do. One is I don't want you to end a speech with, "That's it." That is not an appropriate conclusion. Sometimes people get to the end of these great speeches and then they just have no way to end it. So they're just like, okay, that's it. And it's like, womp womp. Such a letdown. And I don't want you to introduce a new main point. So if you've kind of gotten us now, we've seen the implications of your work, we've gone through your strengths and limitations, we've seen your acknowledgments, and we know you're kind of bringing us into the home stretch. Don't bring up a new topic. Don't bring up a new point, especially if it's something that you're like, oh, I forgot to mention this before, but let me just leave you on this. Don't bring up something new. Save that for the conversation afterwards. So I hope that was helpful, and I'd love to take your questions. If there's something that you think I can do to help you as you prepare, if you have a question, please reach out to me. My email is rugg@pennmedicine.upenn.edu. You can find me on the MPH website. You can catch me in the hallway, but know that you have an entire support system that's here for you. I will inevitably get questions at the end of this all the time about different logistics related to Capstone presentation day. And to that I will say to you that you will hear from me about a week or so out of Capstone presentations, maybe just a little bit more, with a lot of instructions that you're going to need for that day. And I'm telling you, you need to read the whole email. Please read it carefully, because if you don't, on Capstone presentation day, you might have a little flub up, and then that's really a shame when that happens. So read the email, send me your materials in advance, take a deep breath, know that you have an entire group of people that are supporting you, who are so proud of you. You've already done great work. I know you guys are going to do a kick-ass job on your presentations, and I'm happy to support you in any way I can. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.